He had one night to choose a Luna, then the rejected Omega walked into the ceremony. The bell in the pack hall rang 3 times before dawn, and every wolf in Blackthorn territory knew what that meant. Trouble had arrived, and it had arrived at the worst possible hour. Cade Ashford was already awake when the knock came on his door. He had not slept in 2 days. His room smelled of cedar smoke and cold coffee, and the papers on his desk were covered in numbers that made no sense anymore. Trade routes. Border patrols. None of it mattered next to the words the elders had spoken to him only hours earlier. "You have until moonrise tomorrow," Elder Corwin had said, his voice flat and final. "Choose a Luna, or step aside for your cousin." Cade had wanted to laugh. He had wanted to shout that no one could choose a mate the way you chose a coat from a closet. But the elders did not care what he wanted. The pack had gone 3 years without a Luna, and the northern packs were starting to whisper that Blackthorn was weak, leaderless in all but name. Weakness invited attack. Attack meant blood. The elders were not asking him to fall in love. They were asking him to save his people. He opened the door. His beta, a broad-shouldered man named Callum Ridge, stood in the hallway with a face like a closed door. "The candidates have started arriving," Callum said. 4 packs sent their daughters. "The Hargrove family got here an hour ago. They're already talking like the decision's been made." "It hasn't," Cade said. "It will be, by tonight." "You know that." Cade said nothing. He walked past Callum toward the great hall, his boots echoing against old stone. The pack house had stood for over 100 years, its walls carved with the names of every Alpha and Luna who had ever ruled here. Soon his name would sit beside a name he did not yet know, tied to a woman he had never met, bound by a ceremony instead of a bond. He hated it. He hated how much he hated it. Outside, the courtyard was already filling with wolves preparing for the evening ceremony. Servants strung lanterns between the old oak trees. Someone was polishing the stone dais where the choosing would take place. A group of young wolves practiced their bows, rehearsing how they would greet whichever woman became their new Luna. Everyone moved with purpose, except Cade, who felt like a ghost standing in the middle of his own life. His wolf, usually a steady, quiet presence in the back of his mind, had gone strangely restless these past few days. It paced. It growled at nothing. It refused to settle no matter how Cade tried to calm it. He told himself it was only the stress of the ultimatum. He told himself a lot of things lately that he did not fully believe. By mid-morning, the candidates had gathered in the receiving hall, each one flanked by family members eager to see their daughter crowned Luna by nightfall. Cade recognized them all. Leora Bennett, daughter of a powerful trading family, poised and sharp-eyed, already speaking to the other guests as though she owned the room. Rosalind Kerr, quieter, watching everything with careful calculation, and Ivy Hargrove, whose father had all but announced to the elders that his daughter was the obvious choice, the safest choice, the choice that would strengthen an alliance Blackthorn desperately needed. None of them made his wolf stir, not even slightly. He greeted each of them with practiced politeness, the kind he had learned since childhood, the kind that meant nothing and promised nothing. Leora smiled at him, like a woman who already believed she had won. Rosalind studied him like a puzzle she intended to solve before the night was through. Ivy barely looked at him at all, and he wondered, not for the first time, if she wanted this any more than he did. By afternoon, word had spread through the entire territory. Every wolf who could walk had come to see the choosing, some out of loyalty, some out of curiosity, some simply because a decision this important did not happen often, and no one wanted to miss it. The pack had been anxious for years, watching their alpha remain unmated while rival packs grew bolder along the borders. Tonight, that anxiety would finally end, one way or another. Cade spent the day the way he spent most difficult days, walking the edges of his territory alone, letting the trees swallow the noise of the pack house behind him. He passed the old stone bridge where he used to play as a boy. He passed the river where his father had taught him to track scent trails before he was old enough to shift. He passed the narrow dirt road that led toward the outskirts of the territory, where the smaller, quieter homes stood, far from the grandeur of the pack house. He did not know that a woman named Sable Wren lived down that road, in a small house with a garden she tended alone. He did not know her name at all, not yet. Sable had heard about the ceremony the way everyone had, through the constant hum of gossip that moved through the pack faster than any messenger could run. An Omega like her was not invited to such things. Omegas rarely were invited to anything. She had long since stopped expecting invitations to arrive at her door. 3 years ago, her life had looked entirely different. She had been paired with her fated mate, a wolf named Garrett Vane, son of a respected hunting family. For one single, glorious week, she had believed her life was about to become everything she had ever wanted. Then Garrett had stood in front of the entire pack and rejected the bond, calling her unworthy of his family's name, unworthy of a title, unworthy of him. He had chosen another woman within the month. Sable had been left with nothing but the hollow ache of a broken bond, and a rank that fell so low afterward that most wolves stopped speaking to her altogether. Rejection did that to an Omega. It marked you. It followed you into every room you entered, whispered behind your back at every gathering, painted across every face that looked at you and decided, instantly, that you were less than the wolf standing beside you. Sable had learned to live with it. She had built a small, quiet life on the edges of the territory, away from the pack house, away from the eyes that judged her, away from anyone who might remind her of what she had lost. She was in her garden when the messenger came, a young boy she recognized from the healer's house. "Elder Wexley is asking for you," the boy said, breathless from running. "He says it's urgent. He says only you." Sable set down her trowel immediately. Elder Wexley Thorne was the only wolf in the pack who had ever treated her with real kindness after her rejection. He had been the healer's assistant for decades, and when Sable had nowhere else to turn, he had taught her how to tend wounds, how to grind herbs, how to make herself useful in a pack that had decided she was worthless. She owed him more than she could ever repay. She found him in his small room behind the healer's house, propped up on pillows, his breathing shallow and slow. He had been unwell for months, but today his face had a grayness to it that frightened her. "You look terrible," she said, sitting beside his bed and taking his hand. "You always did have a gentle way with words," Wexley said, "and even now, even like this," he managed a small smile. "What do you need? Tell me, and I'll get it." He shook his head slowly. "I need you to do something for me. Something important." He reached beneath his pillow and pulled out a small sealed envelope, worn soft at the edges, as though it had been carried in a pocket for a very long time. Sable stared at it, confused. "This must reach the Alpha before the choosing ceremony begins tonight," Wexley said. "Before he selects a Luna. It cannot wait until after. Why can't someone else deliver it? A runner, a guard, anyone with actual standing in this pack?" "Because I am asking you," Wexley said, his voice firm despite its weakness. "And because I trust no one else to make certain it reaches his hands, and not someone else's. Please, Sable, I have never asked you for anything before." That much was true. In all the years she had known him, Wexley Thorne had given and given, expecting nothing in return. Sable looked at the envelope in his trembling hand, and felt the weight of an old debt settle over her shoulders. "I'll do it," she said, "but I'm not going anywhere near that ceremony. I'll find a guard at the door and hand it off before things begin." "That will have to do," Wexley said, though something in his eyes suggested he had hoped for more. He sank back into his pillows, exhausted from the effort of speaking, and closed his eyes. "Thank you." Sable tucked the envelope into the pocket of her coat, and left the healer's house with a strange unease, sitting heavy in her chest. She told herself it was nothing, a letter, a favor. She would drop it off with a guard and be back in her garden before the sun went down, far from the noise and the lanterns and the crowd that would soon gather to watch the Alpha choose a wife she had no interest in seeing. She did not know, as she walked back toward her small house to change out of her gardening clothes, that fate had other plans for her evening. By the time the sun began sinking behind the mountains, the pack house courtyard had transformed. Lanterns glowed gold between the oak branches. Long tables filled with food lined the edges of the space. Musicians tuned their instruments near the dais, and wolves from every corner of the territory gathered in their finest clothing, whispering to one another about which candidate they believed the Alpha would choose. Cade stood near the edge of the dais, dressed in the formal black coat reserved for ceremonies, feeling like a stranger in his own skin. Callum stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the crowd with the careful eyes of a beta, who took nothing about tonight lightly. "Nervous?" Callum asked quietly. "I feel like I'm about to sign my name to a life I never asked for," Cade said. "You're about to save your pack," Callum corrected. "That's not nothing." Cade did not answer. His eyes moved across the crowd, across Leora's confident posture, Rosalind's watchful stillness, Ivy's carefully blank expression. He tried, one final time, to feel something, anything. A pull, a flicker of interest. His wolf gave him nothing but silence, and somehow that silence felt louder than any howl. The elders took their places at the front of the hall. Elder Corwin raised a hand, and the crowd slowly quieted, the music fading into stillness. Torches crackled. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out over the trees. "Tonight," Corwin announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "Blackthorn Pack will welcome a new Luna." A ripple of excitement moved through the crowd. Cade felt his heart pounding against his ribs, though not from anticipation, from dread. He looked out at the sea of faces watching him, waiting for him to make the choice that would define the rest of his life, and he felt entirely, completely alone. At the edge of the courtyard, near the wooden gate that separated the pack house grounds from the road beyond, Sable Wren stood with the envelope clutched tightly in her hand, searching for a guard who could take it off her hands before anyone noticed she was there at all. She had not expected the ceremony to already be underway. She had not expected the crowd to be quite this large, or the lanterns to glow quite this bright, or her own heart to be beating quite this fast at the thought of stepping any closer to a gathering she had spent 3 years avoiding entirely. She scanned the faces near the gate. No guards in sight. Only wolves, pressed shoulder to shoulder, straining to see the dais where their alpha stood. Sable took a breath, steadied herself, and told herself this would only take a moment. She would slip along the edge of the crowd, find someone, anyone, with enough standing to carry the letter forward, and then she would leave before a single person recognized her face. She had no way of knowing that the moment she stepped past the gate, the entire course of her life was about to change. The letter in her pocket suddenly felt very heavy. She pushed forward into the crowd, weaving between shoulders and elbows, murmuring quiet apologies as she went, her eyes fixed on the dais ahead where the alpha of Blackthorn stood, waiting to choose a woman who was not her. Behind her, the gate swung shut with a soft, final click. Sable pushed through the crowd, trying to keep her head low, trying to make herself as small and unnoticed as possible. It had worked for 3 years. She had perfected the art of being invisible, of walking through a room without drawing a single glance, of existing at the edges where no one bothered to look. Tonight, surrounded by wolves in their finest clothing, all of them focused entirely on the dais ahead, invisibility should have been easy. She spotted a guard near the front, a tall man with a familiar face, someone who had once been kind to her before her rejection made kindness toward her a social risk. She moved toward him, the envelope already coming out of her pocket, her plan simple and clear in her mind. Hand it over. Leave. Forget any of this ever happened. But the crowd was tighter than she expected, and a sudden surge of movement, wolves pressing forward to see better as the elder began to speak, pushed her sideways, away from the guard, and directly toward the open space at the front of the courtyard. She stumbled, caught herself against a low stone wall that lined the edge of the dais, and when she straightened, she realized with a jolt of horror that she was no longer hidden in the crowd at all. She was standing in plain sight, at the very edge of the ceremony, envelope still clutched in her hand, with nowhere to retreat, without drawing even more attention than she already had. Her first instinct was to duck back into the crowd immediately. Her second instinct, the one that actually mattered, came a half-second too late. Cade Ashford's eyes moved across the crowd during Elder Corwin's speech, the way a man's eyes move when his mind is elsewhere and his body is only performing the motions expected of him. He was not looking for anything. He was not expecting anything, and then his gaze landed on a woman standing at the edge of the dais, dressed simply, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes wide with the particular kind of panic that comes from being seen when you desperately did not want to be. Everything in him went still. His wolf, silent for days, for weeks, for years if he was honest with himself, surged forward with a force so sudden it nearly buckled his knees. It was not a flicker of interest. It was not curiosity. It was recognition, deep and absolute, the kind of recognition that only happened once in a wolf's entire life, and only with one single person in the entire world. Mate. The word rang through him like a struck bell, echoing in every corner of his mind, drowning out Elder Corwin's voice, drowning out the music, drowning out the hundreds of eyes watching him from the crowd. He barely registered that he had taken a step forward, then another. His body moved without permission, drawn toward the woman at the edge of the dais the way a compass needle turns toward true north, helpless against a pull far stronger than his own will. Sable saw him move and felt her stomach drop. He was looking directly at her, not glancing, not scanning past her the way every wolf of standing had scanned past her for 3 years, as though she were furniture, as though she were nothing worth noticing. He was looking at her the way she had once believed a mate might look at her, before Garrett Vane taught her that such looks meant nothing, that they could be withdrawn as easily as they were given. She took a step back. He took another step forward. Alpha? Elder Corwin's voice cut through the sudden hush that had fallen over the crowd, confusion clear in his tone. The ceremony had stopped. Every eye in the courtyard had turned first, to follow the Alpha's gaze, then to land on the woman he was walking toward, and a wave of murmurs began rolling through the crowd, like wind through tall grass. Cade did not answer the elder. He kept walking, until he stood only a few feet from Sable, close enough that she could see the stunned, almost dazed expression on his face, close enough that his scent reached her, warm and rich, unlike anything she had ever encountered before. Her wolf, quiet and guarded for years, stirred inside her with a sudden ache that felt disturbingly close to hope. "Who are you?" Cade asked, his voice low, meant only for her, though the silence of the courtyard carried it further than he intended. Sable's mouth went dry. The envelope was still in her hand, forgotten now, crushed slightly in her tightening grip. "My name is Sable. Sable Wren. I was only here to deliver a message." "Sable," he repeated, as though testing the shape of her name against something deep inside himself. "I know you're my mate. I felt it the second I saw you." The words landed in the courtyard like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward through the crowd in the form of gasps and hurried whispers. Leora Bennett's face went pale, then hard with anger. Ivy Hargrove's father stepped forward as though he might physically intervene. Rosalind Kerr simply stared, calculating, already trying to understand what this meant for everyone standing on that dais. Sable felt the weight of every eye in the courtyard settle on her, and old instincts built from 3 years of humiliation, screamed at her to run. "That's not possible," she said quietly. "I am not your mate. I already had a mate once, and I promise you, I know exactly how these bonds work, and how quickly they can be broken." "Then you know I'm not lying about the bond," Cade said. "You feel it too. I can see it in your face." She could not deny it. The pull between them was undeniable, a warmth spreading through her chest that she had spent 3 years telling herself she would never feel again, not after Garrett had ripped that feeling away and left her with nothing but scars. But feeling a bond and trusting a bond were 2 entirely different things, and Sable had learned that lesson at the cost of everything she once had. "I don't know what this is," she said, "but I know it's a mistake. Look around you." She gestured at the crowd, at the dais, at the candidates standing frozen in their finery. "You have a ceremony to finish, a Luna to choose. I was never meant to be part of any of this." She turned to leave, her heart pounding, humiliation and confusion tangled together into something she could not name. But before she could take more than a single step, Cade's hand closed gently around her wrist, not forcing her to stay, simply asking. "Please," he said, and something in his voice, some raw honesty she had not expected from an alpha, made her pause. "Give me a chance to explain, just that much. Then, if you still want to leave, I won't stop you." Elder Corwin had reached the edge of the dais now, his expression a mixture of shock and barely restrained alarm. "Alpha, this is highly irregular. The choosing was meant to proceed among the approved candidates. This woman was not on the list." "The bond doesn't care about your list, Elder," Cade said, not taking his eyes off Sable. "I have searched for a fated mate my entire adult life, and found nothing. Tonight, in the middle of a ceremony meant to bind me to someone I don't know, I find her instead. Tell me how that isn't exactly the sign we've all been waiting for." Murmurs rose again through the crowd, some in disbelief, some in open hostility. Sable heard fragments of it, words like Omega, and rejected, and unworthy, the same words that had followed her for 3 years, now spoken louder, sharper, in front of an even bigger audience than before. Her face burned with old shame she thought she had buried. "You don't understand what you're asking," she said quietly to Cade, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. I am not someone this pack will accept. I already carry the mark of one rejection. I won't survive a second one, especially not in front of everyone I know. I'm not going to reject you, Cade said, and the certainty in his voice startled even him. You don't know that. You don't know me. This is a bond, not a promise. Then let me make you a promise too. Right here, in front of everyone. Cade turned to face the crowd, still holding her wrist, gently, as though she might vanish the moment he let go. This woman is my fated mate. I intend to honor that bond, whatever it takes, and whatever anyone in this courtyard has to say about it. The courtyard erupted into noise, voices rising over one another, the candidates' families shouting protests, the elders exchanging urgent, worried glances. Somewhere near the back, Sable caught sight of Ivy Hargrove's father storming toward the elders, with fury written across his face, already demanding an explanation for the ceremony's sudden collapse. Sable stood frozen at the center of it all, the sealed envelope still crushed in her free hand. Wexley's urgent errand, entirely forgotten in the chaos surrounding her. She looked up at Cade Ashford, this alpha she had never met until minutes ago, and felt something dangerous stirring beneath the fear and the doubt and the old, deep scars. Hope. And hope, she knew from bitter experience, was the most dangerous thing a rejected Omega could ever allow herself to feel. The noise in the courtyard did not fade. If anything, it grew louder with every passing second, a storm of voices rising toward the lantern-lit sky, until Elder Corwin raised both hands and called for silence with a force that finally cut through the chaos. Enough, he said. Enough, all of you. This is a pack matter, and it will be handled with order, not with shouting in front of half the territory. The crowd quieted, though the tension in the air remained thick enough to choke on. Sable felt every eye still fixed on her, weighing her, judging her the way they always had, except now the judgment carried a new and dangerous edge. Before, she had been beneath their notice. Now, she was a threat to everything they had planned for tonight. Cade released her wrist slowly, though he stayed close, his body angled slightly in front of hers, a silent, instinctive act of protection that Sable barely registered through the fog of her own panic. She had not asked for this. She had walked into this courtyard to deliver a letter and leave, and now she stood at the center of a controversy that threatened to unravel an entire pack's carefully planned evening. Alpha Ashford, Elder Corwin said, choosing his words with visible care. A fated bond, if genuine, cannot be denied. That is written into the oldest laws of our kind, but this woman's status within this pack complicates matters considerably. She carries the mark of a previous rejection. The elders will need to discuss what that means for her standing before any further declarations are made. Her standing doesn't change what my wolf recognized the moment I saw her, Cade said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his jaw. With respect, Alpha, it changes everything about how this pack will receive her, Corwin replied. You cannot simply announce a Luna the pack has already rejected once and expect unity to follow. There are procedures, there are expectations. This cannot be settled in a courtyard full of onlookers. Ivy Hargrove's father pushed forward before Cade could respond, his face red with barely contained fury. This is an insult, he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the murmuring crowd. My daughter traveled 2 days for this ceremony, believing she had a fair chance at the position of Luna. Are we now expected to accept that the Alpha's bondmate is a woman already discarded by her own fated match? What does that say about Blackthorn's standards, about the strength of the pack we are meant to align ourselves with? Sable's cheeks burned at the word discarded, spoken so casually, so publicly, as though her worth as a person had already been decided years ago, and nothing that happened tonight could change it. She wanted to run back down the dark road toward her small house and her quiet garden and never think about this courtyard again. That's enough, Cade said, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous, a tone Sable had not heard from him before, though the crowd seemed to recognize it instantly. Several wolves near the front took an involuntary step back. No one in this pack will speak about her that way again. Not her worth, not her history, not anything else. Is that understood? Silence answered him, heavy and uncertain. Sable watched him, this stranger who had, moments ago, been prepared to choose a Luna from among 3 carefully selected candidates, now standing firm in front of an entire pack, to defend a woman he had known for less than 5 minutes. She did not know what to make of it. Every instinct she had built over 3 years of rejection told her this could not last, that kindness, this sudden and this fierce, always came with conditions attached, conditions that would eventually surface and destroy whatever fragile thing had begun to grow. "I need to speak with the elders privately," Cade said, turning back toward Corwin and the others gathered near the dais. "Give me a moment." He turned to Sable before walking away, his expression softening slightly. "Will you wait for me? Just for a few minutes." "I promise I'm not asking you to stay any longer than that." Sable hesitated. Every part of her wanted to say no, wanted to use this small window of confusion to slip away into the darkness beyond the gate and return to the life she had carefully rebuilt for herself, small and quiet and safe from further harm. But something about the sincerity in his eyes, something about the way he had stood between her and the crowd's judgment without hesitation, kept her feet rooted to the ground. "A few minutes," she said quietly. He nodded, and reluctantly, he walked away toward the elders, leaving Sable standing alone at the edge of the dais, while the crowd continued to watch her, whispering, calculating, waiting to see what would happen next. Callum Ridge approached her while Cade spoke with the elders, his expression unreadable, though not unkind. "You should know," he said quietly. "I've never seen him like this. Not once, in all the years I've served as his beta. Whatever just happened between you two, it isn't something he's faking for show." "I don't know what to do with that information," Sable admitted. "Neither do I," Callum said, a faint, tired smile crossing his face. "But for what it's worth, I don't think you walked into this courtyard by accident." Sable thought of Wexley Thorne, lying weak and gray in his bed, pressing the envelope into her hand, with a strange urgency she had not fully understood at the time. She reached into her pocket and found the letter still there, slightly crumpled now, forgotten in the chaos of the evening. She looked down at it, wondering, for the first time, whether Wexley had known exactly what he was sending her into. A short distance away, near the edge of the dais, Elder Corwin's low voice carried just far enough for Sable to catch fragments of the conversation. "Cannot ignore the bond, Alpha, but the pack will not simply accept her without proof of her strength and her worth. You know how deeply the rejection mark affects standing among our people. If you insist on pursuing this, there will need to be a trial, a formal one. The families will demand nothing less." Cade's response was too quiet for Sable to hear clearly, but his posture remained firm, unmoving, a wall of quiet determination against the elder's caution. Whatever he said seemed to settle something, at least for the moment, because Corwin finally nodded, though his expression remained troubled. When Cade returned to her, his jaw was tight, though he attempted a small, reassuring smile. "The elders want to discuss the bond formally, tomorrow, in front of the full council. Tonight's ceremony will be postponed." Behind him, Sable could see Leora Bennett storming toward her family's carriage, her face a mask of humiliated fury. Ivy Hargrove stood quietly beside her father, her expression difficult to read, somewhere between relief and disappointment. Rosalind Kerr lingered near the dais longer than the others, watching Sable with an expression of careful, calculating interest that made Sable's skin prickle with unease. "I should go," Sable said. "I have somewhere to be, someone waiting on an answer." "The letter," Cade said, glancing at the crumpled envelope still in her hand. "You said you came here to deliver a message." "It's for you, actually," Sable said, realizing only now, in the strange quiet after the storm, that she had never actually completed the task Wexley had entrusted her with. She held out the envelope. "From Elder Wexley Thorne. He said it needed to reach you before the ceremony began. I'm afraid I'm several hours late in that regard." Cade took the envelope carefully, turning it over in his hands. His expression shifted as he studied the wax seal pressed into the paper, something like recognition flickering across his face, though he said nothing about it, in front of the lingering crowd. "I'll read this tonight," he said. "Thank you for bringing it, even in the middle of everything else that happened." "I should be the one thanking you," Sable said quietly, "for what you said, about the pack not speaking about me that way. No one has stood up for me like that in a very long time." Something in Cade's expression softened further at her words, a flicker of quiet anger on her behalf, mixed with something gentler underneath it. "You shouldn't have to be grateful for basic decency," he said. "That's a low bar, and I intend to do a great deal better than that, if you'll let me." Sable did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing at all, only nodded once, before turning to leave the courtyard, the crowd parting slightly to let her pass, their eyes following her all the way to the gate. She felt each gaze like a physical weight against her back, old shame mixing uneasily with something new, something she had not expected to feel again after Garrett Vane had taught her to expect nothing from anyone. Cade watched her go, the envelope still clutched in his hand, his wolf restless and unwilling to let her walk out of sight without protest. He forced himself to stay rooted where he stood, understanding, somehow, that chasing after her tonight would only frighten her further, would only confirm every fear she likely carried about bonds that moved too fast and promises that broke too easily. Once the courtyard had mostly emptied, the lanterns burning low, the musicians long gone, Cade retreated to his study with the sealed letter in hand. He broke the wax seal carefully and unfolded the paper inside, his eyes scanning Wexley Thorne's careful, aging handwriting. The letter was short, but its contents struck him like a blow. Alpha Ashford, it began. I am an old wolf now, closer to my final rest than I care to admit, and I find myself needing to speak a truth I have carried for 3 years. When Sable Wren's bond with Garrett Vane was broken, I examined her myself, as the healer's assistant, in the days that followed. What I found troubled me deeply, and troubles me still. The rejection Garrett spoke of publicly does not match what I witnessed in private. There are questions surrounding that night that were never properly answered. Questions the pack chose to ignore, because it was easier to blame the Omega than to examine the Alpha's family. I do not know what has brought you this letter, or what circumstances have placed it in your hands, but I ask you, whoever you are, to treat Sable Wren with the fairness she was denied 3 years ago. She deserves far better than what this pack gave her. Cade read the letter twice, his mind racing through the implications of what Wexley had written. Something about Sable's rejection 3 years ago had never added up, something the old healer had noticed and never been able to prove, or perhaps never been allowed to speak of openly. Now here he was, holding evidence of a mystery he had known nothing about only hours earlier, tied inexplicably to the woman his wolf had just claimed as his fated mate. He thought of Garrett Vane, a name he recognized only distantly, the son of a hunting family with modest standing in the pack. He thought of Sable's fierce, guarded insistence that bonds could be broken as easily as they were made. He thought of the fear in her eyes when the crowd had turned their judgment toward her, fear built on a wound that, according to this letter, might never have been properly understood in the first place. Cade folded the letter carefully and set it on his desk, staring at it for a long moment in the quiet of his study. Tomorrow, the elders would demand proof of Sable's worth before they accepted her as Luna. Tomorrow, the families of the rejected candidates would look for any excuse to tear her down further. Tomorrow, Cade would have to defend a bond the entire pack seemed determined to doubt. But tonight, sitting alone with an old healer's letter and a wolf that refused to settle, Cade made a quiet, private decision. Whatever had truly happened 3 years ago between Sable Wren and Garrett Vane, he intended to find out the truth, no matter what it cost him, and no matter who in his own pack it might implicate. He owed her that much, and his wolf, restless and certain in a way it had never been before, told him he owed her far more than that besides. Sable did not sleep that night. She lay awake in her small bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the courtyard over and over in her mind, until the images blurred together into something that felt more like a fever dream than an actual memory. The Alpha's voice, the crowd's whispers, the word discarded, spoken so easily, so publicly, as though it were simply a fact of her existence, rather than a wound that had never fully healed. By the time morning light crept through her curtains, she had convinced herself that none of it had been real, that she had imagined the pull she felt standing near Cade Ashford, that her wolf had simply been reacting to stress and exhaustion, rather than anything as significant as a fated bond. It was easier to believe that than to accept the alternative, that fate had finally handed her exactly what she once wanted, 3 years too late and wrapped in more danger than comfort. She rose, dressed, and went about her morning as though nothing unusual had happened, tending her small garden with the same careful attention she gave it every day. The herbs needed watering, the fence along the eastern edge needed mending. Ordinary tasks, familiar and grounding, the kind of work that had kept her sane through 3 years of isolation. She was kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds from around a row of chamomile, when she heard footsteps approaching along the path that led to her house. Her heart lurched before she even looked up, some instinctive part of her already recognizing the rhythm of that stride. Cade stood at the edge of her garden, dressed simply today, without the formal coat from the night before, looking somehow both more approachable and more overwhelming at close range in the plain light of morning. "You didn't have to come here," Sable said, rising to her feet and brushing dirt from her knees, more to give her hands something to do than out of any real concern for her appearance. "I wanted to," Cade said, "and I thought you deserved to hear directly from me what the elders decided, rather than through pack gossip." Sable's stomach tightened. "And what did they decide?" "There will be a trial," Cade said. "A formal one, in front of the ranking families and the council. You'll need to prove your strength, your worth, in ways that satisfy the pack's traditional standards, before they'll accept you as Luna, alongside me." "A trial," Sable repeated flatly, because being rejected once wasn't humiliating enough. "I fought against it," Cade said. "I told them the bond alone should be enough. But the elders were firm, and I couldn't force the issue without risking the stability of the entire pack. I'm sorry. I wish I had a better answer for you." Sable turned away from him, staring out at her small, quiet garden, the only piece of the world she had managed to claim entirely for herself over the past 3 years. A trial meant standing in front of judgmental eyes again. A trial meant reopening old wounds in public, giving the families who already despised her another opportunity to tear her apart. "I don't think I can do this," she said quietly. "I know it's a lot to ask," Cade said, stepping closer, though he kept a respectful distance between them. "But I don't think you're as fragile as this pack believes you to be. I don't think you're fragile at all." "You don't know anything about me," Sable said, though there was less bite in her voice than she intended. "You met me yesterday." "That's true," Cade admitted. "But I read something last night that made me believe there's more to your story than what this pack decided to believe 3 years ago." He hesitated, then reached into his coat, and withdrew the folded letter Wexley had entrusted to her. "Elder Wexley wrote this. He examined you himself after your rejection, and he says what he found didn't match the story Garrett Vane told the pack." Sable's breath caught. She had never known that Wexley harbored doubts about her rejection. He had cared for her afterward, tended to the physical exhaustion and emotional wreckage that followed a broken bond, but he had never once spoken to her about doubting the official account of what happened. "What does the letter say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That the circumstances of your rejection never fully added up, and that he believed the pack blamed you unfairly, rather than examining Garrett's family more closely." Cade held the letter out to her. "I don't know the full truth yet, but I intend to find it, if you'll let me help." Sable took the letter with trembling hands, reading Wexley's careful script for herself, the words blurring slightly, as unexpected tears gathered in her eyes. 3 years of carrying blame that was never fully hers to carry. 3 years of believing herself unworthy because an old healer had never found the right moment or the right courage to speak the doubts he clearly harbored. "Why didn't he tell me this himself?" she asked, her voice thick. "I don't know," Cade admitted. "Perhaps he was protecting you from more pain until he had proof. Perhaps he was afraid of accusing a respected family without evidence to back his suspicions. Whatever the reason, I think it's worth finding the truth now, regardless of how the trial ends." Sable folded the letter carefully, holding it against her chest, as though it might somehow anchor her against the storm building inside her. Hope again, dangerous and unwelcome, refusing to be pushed away no matter how firmly she tried to guard against it. "The trial," she said finally. "What exactly does it involve?" 3 tests, traditionally, Cade said. A test of strength, judged by combat or a physical challenge. A test of wisdom, judged by the council through questioning. And a test of loyalty, judged by the pack itself, through their willingness to accept you. He paused. "It's outdated, unfair, in a lot of ways, but it's also the only path the elders will accept, short of open rebellion against pack tradition." "And if I fail any part of it?" Cade's jaw tightened. "Then the elders will insist I choose a Luna from among the original candidates, bond or no bond." Sable absorbed that in silence, staring down at the letter in her hands, at Wexley's careful, hopeful handwriting, at a truth 3 years overdue that had arrived at exactly the moment she needed it most. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this," she admitted quietly, the confession costing her more than she expected it to. I think you survived something this pack should never have put you through, Cade said, and you rebuilt an entire life afterward, alone, without a single person standing beside you. I don't think strength is something you're lacking. I think it's something this pack has simply refused to see. Sable looked up at him, searching his face for the falseness she expected to find there. The same falseness that had lived behind Garrett Vane's eyes in the weeks before he destroyed her. She found none. Only steady, quiet certainty, and something warmer beneath it that made her chest ache in a way she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. When does the trial begin? She asked. 3 days from now, Cade said. It gives us time to prepare, and time to find out what really happened 3 years ago, if you're willing to look into it with me. Sable glanced back at her small garden, at the quiet, careful life she had built for herself out of the wreckage Garrett Vane had left behind. 3 days from now, that quiet life would be tested in front of the entire pack, in front of families who already wanted her gone, in front of a truth that might finally set her free, or might destroy whatever fragile hope had begun to bloom inside her, since the moment their eyes had first met across a crowded courtyard. All right, she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Let's find out the truth, all of it, no matter where it leads. Cade's expression eased into something like relief, though the tension in his shoulders did not fully disappear. Thank you, he said. I promise you won't face this trial alone. Whatever the elders demand, whatever the families throw at you, I'll be standing beside you through every part of it. Sable wanted, desperately, to believe him. And for the first time in 3 long years, some small, stubborn part of her allowed herself to hope that this time, the promise might actually hold. News of the postponed ceremony spread through Blackthorn territory faster than fire through dry grass. By midday, every wolf in the pack seemed to know the story, though the details shifted and twisted with each retelling. Some said the Alpha had gone mad. Some said the rejected Omega had used dark magic to force a false bond. Some, a smaller number, whispered that perhaps fate simply did not care about pack politics and had chosen its own path regardless of what the elders preferred. Sable heard none of it directly, since almost no one spoke to her at all, but she saw it in the way eyes followed her when she walked to the market for supplies, in the way conversations dropped to sudden silence when she passed too close, in the way children were pulled gently but firmly away from her path by watchful parents. 3 years of practice had taught her how to walk through that kind of scrutiny without letting it show on her face. It was harder now, knowing that within days, she would stand in front of all of them and be judged all over again. Cade spent those same hours in a very different kind of storm. Elder Corwin summoned him twice more before sundown, each conversation circling the same anxious ground. The families of the rejected candidates were furious, some threatening to withdraw long-standing alliances if the Alpha proceeded with what they viewed as an embarrassing, reckless decision. Ivy Hargrove's father was the loudest among them, though Cade suspected his anger stemmed less from genuine concern for pack unity, and more from wounded pride at his daughter's public dismissal. You understand what you're risking, Corwin said during their second meeting, pacing the length of his study with visible agitation. Alliances that took decades to build, the confidence of families who expected a Luna worthy of real political weight, and for what? A bond you cannot yet prove holds any strength beyond first attraction. The bond isn't about political weight, Elder, Cade said. It's about fate choosing the wolf, meant to stand beside me. I didn't ask for this. I didn't plan it. But I won't turn my back on it, simply because it's inconvenient for people who wanted a different outcome. Inconvenient, Corwin repeated, something almost admiring beneath his exasperation. You have always had your father's stubbornness, Alpha. I only hope it serves you as well as it served him. Cade thought of his father often these days, a wolf who had ruled Blackthorn with a steady, quiet strength for over 20 years, before passing leadership to his son. His father had married for duty, not for fate, a political match that had produced a functional but distant partnership. Cade had watched that distance his entire childhood, and had promised himself, quietly, that he would never settle for the same hollow arrangement if he could help it. Now fate had offered him something entirely different, and he intended to fight for it with everything he had. Late that afternoon, Cade made his way to the healer's house to speak with Wexley Thorne directly, hoping the old healer's weakened condition would not prevent a conversation about the letter that had upended so much in a single night. He found Wexley awake, propped against his pillows, looking marginally stronger than he had the day before, though still fragile, in a way that worried Cade deeply. "I wondered when you'd come," Wexley said, his voice weak but clear. "I take it Sable delivered my letter, given the chaos I've heard rumors of all day." "She did," Cade said, settling into the chair beside the bed. "I need you to tell me everything you remember about the night of her rejection, everything you found that didn't match Garrett Vane's account." Wexley's expression grew serious, the weariness in his eyes sharpening into something more focused. "I examined her the following morning, at the healer's request, since rejection wounds require careful tending. What I found troubled me immediately. The physical marks of a genuine rejection carry a particular pattern, alpha, one any experienced healer learns to recognize. What I saw on Sable did not match that pattern. It was inconsistent, rushed, almost, as though the bond had been severed with unusual haste and unusual force." "What does that mean?" Cade asked. "It could mean many things," Wexley admitted, "but my suspicion, formed over years of tending to bonded and broken pairs, is that something happened that night, beyond a simple, natural rejection. I believe Garrett Vane may have been pressured into breaking the bond, rather than choosing to break it freely." Cade sat back, absorbing the implication slowly. "Pressured by whom?" "That I never discovered," Wexley said. "I raised my concerns quietly with the healer at the time, but she urged caution, reminding me that accusing a respected family without solid proof could bring serious consequences down on both of us. I let the matter rest, though it has troubled my conscience every day since. When I felt my strength failing these past weeks, I knew I could not let the truth die with me unspoken." "Do you have any idea who might have pressured him? Any names? Any suspicions at all?" Wexley hesitated, his fingers plucking absently at the blanket covering his lap. "There were rumors, at the time, that Garrett's family had been in talks with the Kerr family regarding a different match, one that would have strengthened certain trade connections considerably. Rosalind Kerr was quite young then, barely of bonding age, but her family has always played a long, patient game when it comes to alliances." Cade felt a chill move through him at the mention of the Kerr name, remembering Rosalind's careful, calculating expression the night before, the way she had lingered near the dais longer than the other candidates, watching Sable with an interest that had unsettled him even at the time. "Rosalind Kerr was one of the candidates for Luna last night," Cade said slowly. Wexley's eyes widened slightly. "Was she? That is troubling information, Alpha, though I want to be careful not to accuse without proof. My suspicions are old and unconfirmed. But if her family orchestrated something 3 years ago to clear the way for a more advantageous match, and if that same family believed she stood a real chance of becoming Luna last night, it would not surprise me if they saw Sable as a lingering threat worth eliminating, then and possibly still now." Cade rose from his chair, his mind racing through the implications, through the trial only days away, through the families who would be watching Sable's every move for a single misstep they could exploit. If Rosalind Kerr's family had a history of manipulating bonds to serve their ambitions, there was no reason to believe they would hesitate to do so again, especially with so much at stake. "Thank you," Cade said. "This gives me somewhere to start looking." "Be careful, Alpha," Wexley warned, his weak voice carrying a surprising weight of urgency. "If my suspicions are correct, whoever orchestrated Sable's original rejection has already shown they're willing to destroy an innocent wolf to protect their own interests. They will not hesitate to do so again if they feel threatened." Cade nodded grimly, thinking of Sable in her small garden, rebuilding a life from the wreckage of a betrayal she never fully understood, now standing at the center of a trial that powerful, ambitious families wanted desperately for her to fail. He thought of the 3 days remaining before that trial began, and the growing certainty that those 3 days would need to be spent uncovering far more than simply how to prepare her for a test of strength and wisdom and loyalty. He needed to uncover the truth of what happened 3 years ago, before someone determined to keep that truth buried found a way to silence it permanently, along with anyone who dared to dig too close to it. Cade did not tell Sable everything Wexley had suggested, not at first. He wanted more than an old healer's suspicion before he placed the weight of an accusation on a family as influential as the Kerrs. Instead, he spent the following morning quietly gathering what information he could, speaking carefully with pack members, who had been present the night of Sable's rejection 3 years earlier, searching for anyone whose memory might confirm or deny what Wexley believed. Sable, unaware of the direction Cade's investigation had taken, spent that same morning trying to prepare herself for a trial she barely understood the shape of. She had never trained for combat. She had never studied pack law closely enough to answer a council's probing questions with confidence. And the idea of standing in front of the pack and asking them to accept her, to truly accept her, after 3 years of being treated as invisible at best and shameful at worst, felt like the most impossible task of all. She was practicing simple defensive movements in her garden, movements she vaguely remembered from childhood lessons long since abandoned, when Callum Ridge appeared at her gate, watching her with an expression somewhere between amusement and concern. "You're doing that wrong," he said. Sable straightened, embarrassed at being caught, though she tried not to let it show. "I wasn't aware I had an audience." "The Alpha asked me to help you prepare for the trial," Callum said, stepping into the garden without waiting for an invitation. "Combat training, specifically. He's occupied with other matters this morning, but he didn't want you facing this unprepared." Sable eyed him warily. She barely knew Callum, had exchanged only a handful of words with him the previous night, and something about accepting help from an Alpha's beta felt uncomfortably like accepting charity from a pack that had never offered her any before. "I don't need pity training," she said. "Good, because I wasn't planning on giving you any," Callum said, a faint smile crossing his face. "I've trained every young wolf who's come through this pack in the last decade. I don't do it out of pity. I do it because I enjoy watching people surprise themselves." Something in his tone, direct and unbothered by the weight of her history, put Sable slightly more at ease. She lowered her guard, just slightly, and allowed him to correct her stance, adjusting the angle of her shoulders, the placement of her feet, the way she held her hands ready, rather than clenched uselessly at her sides. "You're stronger than you think," Callum observed after they had run through several drills. Sable's breathing heavier now, sweat beading along her hairline despite the cool morning air. "Most wolves who've spent 3 years isolated the way you have lose their edge entirely. You haven't. If anything, you've sharpened it, just in different ways than the pack usually measures. Tending a garden and grinding herbs doesn't exactly translate to fighting skill," Sable said between breaths. "Doesn't it?" Callum challenged. "You've survived 3 years of a hostile pack without a single ally, without a single misstep that gave them a real excuse to push you out entirely. That takes more discipline and more strategy than most wolves who've never faced real adversity ever develop. You've been training this whole time. Just not in the way anyone expected." Sable considered that as they continued the lesson, something shifting quietly inside her, a reframing of 3 years she had only ever thought of as suffering, now viewed instead as a kind of quiet, grinding preparation for exactly this moment. It did not erase the pain of those years, but it gave the pain a different weight, one she had not considered before. They trained through the late morning, Callum pushing her steadily harder, without ever crossing into cruelty, correcting her mistakes with patience, rather than judgment. By the time he finally called an end to the session, Sable's muscles ached in ways she had not felt in years, but something beneath the exhaustion felt oddly like pride. "You'll be ready," Callum said as he prepared to leave. "The physical test won't be your biggest challenge in that trial anyway." "What will be?" "The council's questioning," Callum said. "They'll try to trip you up, catch you contradicting yourself, find some excuse to paint you as unfit beyond the physical. Answer their questions honestly, and don't let them provoke you into losing your composure. That's what they're truly hoping for." Sable nodded slowly, filing the advice away, grateful in a way she did not fully know how to express, toward a man who had shown her more genuine investment in her success, within a single morning, than most of the pack had offered her in 3 years combined. Meanwhile, across the territory, Cade had tracked down an elderly pack member named Beatrix Yarrow, a woman who had served as a healer's aide alongside Wexley in the years before her retirement, and who had reportedly been present in the healer's house on the night of Sable's rejection. Beatrix received him in her small cottage with cautious hospitality, offering tea he did not particularly want, but accepted anyway, as a gesture of goodwill. Once seated, Cade explained, carefully and without naming names, that he was investigating irregularities surrounding a rejection that had taken place 3 years prior. Beatrix's expression grew guarded almost immediately. "I remember that night," she admitted after a long pause. It was unusual. Garrett Vane arrived at the healer's house afterward, alone, looking shaken in a way that didn't quite match a wolf who'd simply decided to reject his mate. Wexley noticed it too, though we never spoke of our concerns publicly. Did he say anything to you? Anything about why he made the decision he did? Beatrix hesitated, glancing toward her window as though checking for eavesdroppers before continuing in a lower voice. He said very little, but I remember one thing clearly, he said, and I recall his exact words because they struck me as strange at the time, that he had no other choice. Not that he didn't love her, not that she wasn't good enough, that he had no other choice. I always wondered what he meant by that, but it wasn't my place to press him further. Cade absorbed that information carefully, the pieces beginning to align with Wexley's suspicions in a way that felt increasingly difficult to ignore. A wolf who rejected his fated mate typically spoke of the bond itself, of feelings that failed to develop, of instincts that refused to align. Garrett Vane had spoken, instead of choice, or the absence of it, language that suggested pressure from somewhere beyond his own heart. Do you know where Garrett Vane lives now? Cade asked. He left the territory not long after his rejection of Sable settled and his new bond with another woman was announced, Beatrix said. I heard he moved south, to a smaller pack near the coast. I couldn't tell you exactly where. Cade thanked her for her time and left the small cottage with more questions than answers, though the shape of a troubling truth was beginning to form nonetheless. If Garrett Vane had been pressured into rejecting Sable, and if Rosalind Kerr's family had motive to see that pressure applied, then the trial only 2 days away might be more dangerous for Sable than a simple test of strength and wisdom. It might be an opportunity for whoever orchestrated the original betrayal to finish what they had started 3 years earlier, this time with far more at stake, and far less patience for a rejected Omega who refused to stay quietly forgotten at the edges of the pack she had once been cast out from. Cade returned to the pack house with grim determination settling over him, understanding now that protecting Sable through the trial would require more than standing beside her in front of the council. It would require uncovering the truth before someone with far more to lose than pride decided that silence, permanent and absolute, was the only way to keep their secrets buried. That evening, Cade found Sable in her garden again, this time simply sitting among the herbs rather than tending them, her knees pulled up to her chest, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and violet. He hesitated at the gate, unwilling to intrude on whatever quiet thoughts occupied her, but she noticed him before he could decide whether to stay or leave. Callum told me you spent the day investigating, she said as he approached. He wouldn't tell me what you found, said it wasn't his place. Cade sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, careful not to close the distance further without her invitation. I spoke with Beatrix Yarrow. She worked alongside Wexley as a healer's aide when your rejection happened. Sable's body tensed slightly, old wounds rising close to the surface at the mention of that night. What did she tell you? Cade relayed the conversation carefully, watching Sable's expression shift from wariness to something closer to devastated confusion as the implications settled over her. No other choice. Words that suggested her rejection had never truly been about her at all, that the pain she had carried for 3 years, the shame, the isolation, might have been built on a foundation of manipulation rather than genuine judgment of her worth. You think someone forced him, Sable said quietly, more statement than question. I think it's a strong possibility, Cade said, and I think Rosalind Kerr's family may have had a motive, given rumors of an alternate match they were pursuing for Garrett at the time. Sable was quiet for a long moment, processing the weight of what he was suggesting. If that's true, she said finally, then everything I've believed about myself for 3 years, every reason I told myself I deserved what happened to me, none of it was ever real. It was just a story someone else wrote to protect their own interests, and I spent 3 years living inside it like it was truth. You didn't deserve any of what happened to you, Cade said firmly. Not the rejection, and certainly not 3 years of isolation afterward. Whatever the truth turns out to be, I need you to understand that now, before the trial, not after. Sable turned to look at him, tears gathering in her eyes despite her clear effort to hold them back. It's hard to unlearn 3 years of believing something, even when someone hands you proof it was never true. I know, Cade said gently. but you don't have to unlearn it alone anymore. They sat together in silence, as the last light faded from the sky, the weight of the coming trial pressing against both of them, along with the growing certainty that whoever had orchestrated Sable's original rejection would not simply stand aside while their carefully buried secret threatened to surface again. Cade thought of Rosalind Kerr's calculating expression the night of the ceremony, of the careful, patient way her family built alliances over years rather than months, and felt a familiar unease settle deep in his chest. The trial was 2 days away. Whatever truth remained buried in the past, they would need to uncover it quickly, before someone determined to protect their secrets decided that Sable's silence, one way or another, was worth whatever it cost to secure. 2 days later, the pack hall filled once again, with wolves eager to witness a spectacle 3 years in the making, though this time, the atmosphere carried a sharper, more dangerous edge than the postponed choosing ceremony had. The elders sat at the front of the hall in a solemn row, flanked by representatives from the ranking families, all of them watching the doors with barely concealed anticipation. Sable stood at the entrance beside Cade, dressed simply, but with more confidence in her posture than she had carried in years. Callum's training and the truth of Wexley's letter settled into her like a quiet, steady armor against whatever the trial intended to throw at her. "Whatever happens in there," Cade said quietly as they prepared to enter, "I want you to know, I already consider you my Luna. Nothing this council decides will change that." Sable managed a small, grateful smile, despite the anxiety twisting through her stomach. "Let's just get through it first." They entered the hall together, the crowd's murmurs rising and falling around them, and Sable caught sight of Rosalind Kerr, seated near the front beside her family, her expression carefully neutral, though something in her eyes, when they briefly met Sable's, carried a flicker of tension that had not been there before. Elder Corwin rose to address the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony and tradition. "We gather today to witness the trial of Sable Wren, whose bond with our Alpha demands proof of strength, wisdom, and loyalty before this pack will accept her as Luna. Let the first test begin." Sable took a steadying breath, feeling Cade's hand brush briefly against hers, a small, grounding gesture before she stepped forward to face whatever the pack intended to demand of her. Behind the calm exterior she forced herself to maintain. Her mind raced through everything she had learned in the past 2 days, the truth of her rejection, the family that may have orchestrated it, and the growing, unsettling certainty that this trial was about far more than proving her worth to a skeptical pack. It was about surviving whatever those determined to keep old secrets buried were willing to do, to ensure she never uncovered the truth at all. The first test began without ceremony, beyond Elder Corwin's brief announcement. A challenge of physical strength, meant to prove Sable could stand and fight beside her Alpha, if the pack's safety ever demanded it. A wide circle had been marked at the center of the hall, and standing within it, arms crossed and expression cold, was a young female warrior named Petra Falk, chosen by the council specifically for her skill in close combat. Sable stepped into the circle, aware of every eye in the hall fixed on her, aware of Rosalind Kerr's careful, watchful expression among the crowd, aware of Cade standing tense and silent at the circle's edge, forbidden by tradition from intervening once the test began. "Yield when you cannot continue," Elder Corwin instructed. "This is a test of effort and resilience, not a fight to injury. Begin." Petra moved first, quick and precise, testing Sable's defenses with a series of controlled strikes that Sable barely managed to block, Callum's 2 days of training rushing back to her in fragments, as her body responded on instinct rather than conscious thought. She stumbled once, caught herself, and answered with a counter that surprised even her, driving Petra back a step. The crowd murmured with unexpected interest. This was not the easy victory many had anticipated. The exchange continued, blow for blow, both women breathing hard, sweat gathering along Sable's brow as she fought to keep pace with a trained warrior, who had spent years honing skills Sable had only begun learning 2 days earlier. She took a hit to her shoulder that staggered her, and for a moment, doubt flickered through her mind, old and familiar, whispering that she was not strong enough, that she never had been, that this trial would only confirm what the pack already believed about her. She thought of 3 years spent surviving alone, of a garden built from nothing, of a quiet resilience Callum had recognized in her before she recognized it in herself. She straightened, steadied her stance, and met Petra's next strike with a defense so solid It drove the warrior back with visible surprise. The match continued for several more minutes before Elder Corwin finally called a halt, judging that Sable had demonstrated sufficient effort and skill to satisfy the trial's demands, even without securing an outright victory. Sable stood in the circle, breathing hard, bruised but unbroken, and felt something unfamiliar swell in her chest as scattered applause rose from portions of the crowd. Wolves who had never once acknowledged her now watching, with something closer to respect. "The first test is passed," Corwin announced. "We proceed to the second, a test of wisdom before this council." Sable took her place at the center of the hall once more, facing the row of elders seated before her, their expressions ranging from curious to openly skeptical. This test, she understood, was the one Callum had warned her about most seriously, the one designed to catch her in contradiction, to expose weakness the physical trial could not reach. The questions came rapid and probing. What responsibilities did Aluna carry beyond standing beside her alpha? How would she handle a dispute between rival families within the pack? What understanding did she hold of pack law regarding border disputes and trade agreements? Sable answered each in turn, carefully, honestly, drawing on knowledge she had absorbed quietly over 3 years of isolation, reading whatever books she could access, listening carefully whenever pack matters were discussed within earshot, filling the empty hours of her exile with education no one had ever expected her to use. The elders exchanged surprised glances as her answers continued, thoughtful and well-reasoned, revealing a mind sharper and more prepared than the pack had ever given her credit for. Then one of the ranking family representatives, an older man aligned closely with the Hargrove family, rose with a harder edge in his questioning. "You claim understanding of loyalty and pack law," he said. "Yet you yourself carry the mark of a broken bond. How can this pack trust your loyalty when your own fated mate once judged you unworthy of it?" The hall fell silent, the question landing with deliberate cruelty, designed to reopen the exact wound Sable had spent 3 years trying to close. She felt the old shame rising, the instinct to shrink, to apologize for an existence the pack had decided was shameful. She pushed it down and lifted her chin instead. "My previous bond was broken, under circumstances this pack never fully investigated," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor she felt beneath it. "I have recently learned there is significant reason to believe that rejection was not a genuine reflection of my worth, but the result of pressure applied by another family, seeking to protect their own ambitions. I intend to see that truth uncovered fully, regardless of how uncomfortable it proves for anyone in this hall." A ripple of startled murmuring moved through the crowd. Cade watched from the circle's edge, pride swelling in his chest at her composure, while across the hall, Rosalind Kerr's careful neutrality cracked, just slightly, into something closer to alarm. Elder Corwin raised a hand, quieting the hall once more. "That is a serious accusation, Sable Wren. Do you have proof to support it?" "Not yet," Sable admitted, "but I intend to find it." The questioning continued for several more minutes, though the sharp edge of the earlier challenge had softened somewhat, the council seemingly satisfied with the depth of Sable's answers, despite the tension her accusation had introduced. Finally, Corwin declared the second test complete, and Sable stepped back from the center of the hall, exhausted but steady. One test remaining between her and the acceptance she had spent 3 years believing she would never receive. "The final test," Corwin announced, "is a test of loyalty, judged by the pack itself. Those gathered here will be given the opportunity to speak, in support or in opposition, before a final vote is cast." Sable's stomach tightened at the prospect. A physical trial and a battle of questions she could prepare for, could fight through with skill and knowledge. But the pack's judgment, freely given by wolves who had spent 3 years treating her as invisible, or worse, felt like the most uncertain test of all, one she had no way to control no matter how hard she had prepared. She glanced toward Cade, who offered her a small, steady nod, silent reassurance that whatever the pack decided, he remained unmoved in his own conviction. Sable drew a slow breath, steadied herself, and turned to face the crowd, bracing herself for whatever judgment they intended to deliver. Elder Corwin opened the floor to the pack with a simple gesture, and for a long, agonizing moment, silence hung over the hall. Sable stood at the center of the room, exposed and vulnerable, in a way neither the combat trial nor the council's questioning had made her feel. waiting to see whether 3 years of isolation had left her entirely without allies in a pack that had once decided, collectively and without hesitation, that she deserved to be discarded. The silence broke when Beatrix Yarrow rose slowly from her seat near the back of the hall. "I have known Sable Wren since she was a child," Beatrix said, her aged voice carrying clearly, despite its frailty. "I watched this pack turn its back on her 3 years ago, without ever questioning whether the story we were told was the whole truth. I have recently learned there is real reason to doubt that story. I, for one, believe this pack owes her more than judgment. We owe her an apology." A murmur of surprise moved through the crowd, though Sable noticed several faces nodding in cautious agreement. Beatrix's words seemed to loosen something in the room, permission, perhaps, for others who had privately doubted the old story to finally speak aloud. Callum rose next, his voice firm and unhesitating. "I trained beside her these past 2 days. I have trained many wolves in this pack, and I can tell you plainly that Sable Wren possesses more resilience and more discipline than most warriors born and raised within these walls. Whatever this pack decided about her 3 years ago, I believe we were wrong." More voices followed, hesitant at first, then growing steadier as the tide of the room began to shift. A woman from the healer's house spoke of Sable's quiet kindness, intending to Wexley through his illness. A young wolf spoke of Sable helping his family through a difficult winter years ago, an act of generosity offered without expectation of anything in return, from a woman the pack had given her every reason to resent instead. Not every voice in the hall spoke in her favor. Ivy Hargrove's father rose with obvious reluctance, his opposition rooted more in wounded pride over his daughter's dismissal than any genuine grievance against Sable herself, and several other ranking family members echoed his hesitation, unwilling to fully embrace an Omega who had spent 3 years at the bottom of the pack's hierarchy. But the balance of the room, Sable realized with something close to disbelief, had tipped further in her favor than she had ever dared to hope. Rosalind Kerr remained silent throughout the proceedings, her expression carefully composed, though Sable noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands remained clenched tightly in her lap, throughout every testimony offered in Sable's defense. When Elder Corwin finally called for the vote, Rosalind's vote came without hesitation, firmly against acceptance, though it did little to sway the growing tide of support Sable had unexpectedly earned. The final count, when Corwin announced it, revealed an overwhelming majority in favor of accepting Sable Wren as Luna of Blackthorn Pack. The hall erupted into a mixture of applause and disgruntled murmuring, but Sable barely registered any of it, her eyes fixed instead on Cade, who crossed the distance between them in a few quick strides, his expression a mixture of relief and fierce pride that made her chest ache with an emotion she had not allowed herself to feel in years. "You did it," he said quietly, close enough that only she could hear him clearly over the noise of the hall. "We did it," Sable corrected, her voice trembling slightly. "I couldn't have gotten through any of this without you standing beside me." Elder Corwin approached them both once the hall had settled slightly, his expression solemn but not unkind. "The trial is complete. The pack has spoken. Sable Wren, you are recognized as Luna of Blackthorn Pack, bonded to Alpha Cade Ashford by fate, and now accepted by this pack through trial and testimony." He paused, glancing briefly toward Rosalind Kerr's tense, unmoving figure near the front of the hall. "I understand there remain unresolved questions about the circumstances of your original rejection. I would encourage you both to pursue that truth fully. This pact does not tolerate manipulation of sacred bonds for personal ambition, regardless of which family might be implicated." Sable nodded, gratitude and lingering wariness mixing together in equal measure. The trial had ended in her favor, but the truth behind her original rejection remained buried, and she suspected, watching Rosalind's carefully controlled expression from across the hall, that whoever had orchestrated that original betrayal would not simply accept defeat now that Sable's standing within the pack had been secured. As the crowd began to disperse, well-wishers approaching cautiously to offer congratulations they would never have considered offering only days earlier, Sable caught sight of Rosalind slipping quietly toward the hall's side exit, her expression tight with barely restrained fury, already deep in hushed conversation with an older woman Sable recognized as her mother, head of the Kerr family's considerable trading interests. Cade noticed the same thing, his jaw tightening as he watched them disappear through the doorway. "This isn't over," he murmured, more to himself than to Sable. "I know," Sable said quietly. But for tonight, let me just be grateful for what we've won." Cade turned back to her, his expression softening as he took her hand, weaving his fingers through hers in front of the entire hall, a public claim that carried far more weight than any formal announcement could have offered. "Tonight, you're my Luna," he said. "Tomorrow, we finish uncovering the truth, whatever it costs, and whoever it implicates." Sable squeezed his hand, drawing strength from the warmth of his palm against hers, from the steady certainty in his eyes, from the unexpected, hard-won acceptance of a pack that had spent 3 years believing her unworthy of exactly this moment. She had survived rejection once, alone and unsupported, and rebuilt herself from nothing. Whatever Rosalind Kerr and her family intended next, Sable intended to face it not as the discarded Omega she had been 3 years ago, but as the Luna Blackthorn pack had finally, truly chosen to accept. The Kerr family estate sat on the eastern edge of Blackthorn territory, a grand house surrounded by carefully maintained trade warehouses that had made the family's fortune over 3 generations. Inside a private study, lit by a single lamp, Rosalind Kerr paced the length of the room, while her mother, Delphine Kerr, sat calmly behind a heavy wooden desk, her expression unreadable. "The trial went against us," Rosalind said, her composure from the hall entirely gone now, replaced by sharp, barely controlled frustration. "That old healer's letter has undone 3 years of careful planning. If they find proof of what happened to Garrett Vane, this family's reputation will be destroyed." "Sit down, Rosalind," Delphine said calmly. "Panic accomplishes nothing." "Panic is a reasonable response to ruin," Rosalind snapped, though she obeyed, sinking into the chair across from her mother's desk. "What are we going to do? The Alpha is already investigating. It's only a matter of time before he finds someone willing to confirm what we did to Garrett 3 years ago. No one who assisted us then has any incentive to confess now," Delphine said. "Garrett Vane received a generous settlement in exchange for his silence and his cooperation. He left the territory precisely to avoid this exact conversation ever taking place. As long as he stays gone, and as long as everyone else involved understands the value of their continued discretion, there is nothing to connect us definitively to what happened. And if Sable Wren tracks him down? If the Alpha sends someone to find him and convinces him to speak the truth?" Delphine's expression finally shifted, a flicker of genuine concern crossing her carefully composed features. "That would be a problem," she admitted. "One I intend to address before it becomes a certainty rather than a possibility." "How?" "I have contacts in the Southern Territories," Delphine said. "I will ensure Garrett Vane understands the wisdom of relocating even further from Blackthorn's reach, and the wisdom of remaining silent regardless of who comes asking questions. In the meantime, you will do what you do best, Rosalind. You will watch, and you will listen, and you will find opportunities to undermine this Luna, before she becomes too deeply rooted in her position to challenge." Rosalind's expression hardened with renewed purpose. The pack accepted her, but not unanimously. There are still families uneasy about an Omega, with a rejection mark holding the position of Luna. If I can find a way to reignite that doubt, publicly, in a way that damages her credibility beyond what a single trial can repair. "Now you're thinking clearly," Delphine said approvingly. "Sable Wren survived a trial designed to prove her worth. She has not yet proven she can survive sustained, sophisticated pressure applied by someone who understands exactly how to exploit old wounds. Find that pressure point, Rosalind, and use it." Across the territory, unaware of the quiet conspiracy forming against her, Sable spent her first days as Luna, adjusting to a life entirely unfamiliar to her, moving from her small, quiet house on the outskirts into the pack house itself, learning the countless responsibilities that came with a title she had never expected to hold. Cade remained close throughout the transition, patient and steady, introducing her gradually to the administrative duties of running a territory, the delicate diplomacy required in managing relationships with neighboring packs, the countless small decisions that shape the daily lives of everyone under Blackthorn's protection. It was overwhelming and exhausting, and unlike anything Sable had imagined for herself even in her most hopeful daydreams, but beneath the exhaustion, something steady and genuine had begun to grow between them, a partnership built not on the sudden intensity of their bonding, but on the quiet, accumulating trust of days spent working side by side. "You're a natural at this," Cade told her one evening, several days into her new role, as they reviewed a proposed trade agreement with a neighboring pack. You ask better questions than most of the advisors who've served this pack for 20 years. I spent 3 years with nothing to do but read and observe, Sable said, though a small, pleased smile tugged at her lips despite her attempt at modesty. I suppose all that isolation was good for something after all. Cade reached across the table and covered her hand with his, a small, simple gesture that had become increasingly natural between them over the past week. I'm sorry it took this pack so long to see what you were capable of. You saw it, Sable said quietly. That night in the courtyard, before anyone else did. That matters more than I think I've properly told you. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a knock at the study door, Callum entering with a troubled expression that immediately drew both their attention. There's something you need to see, he said, holding out a folded piece of paper. It's being circulated through the market and the training grounds. I've already collected as many copies as I could find, but I doubt I caught them all. Cade unfolded the paper, his jaw tightening as he read the contents, before passing it wordlessly to Sable. Her stomach dropped as she scanned the page, a crudely written pamphlet questioning the legitimacy of her bond with Cade, suggesting the Omega class was inherently unfit for leadership, regardless of any fated connection, and reviving old, cruel rumors about the exact nature of her original rejection, twisted now into something even uglier than the truth Wexley had uncovered. Who wrote this? Sable asked, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. There's no name attached, obviously, Callum said, but the handwriting and the specific accusations feel deliberate, targeted. This isn't random gossip. Someone crafted this carefully to reopen old wounds and cast doubt on your standing. Sable thought immediately of Rosalind Kerr, of the tension in her shoulders during the trial, of the fury barely contained beneath her carefully composed exterior as she left the hall. Rosalind, she said aloud. We have no proof, Cade said, though his expression suggested he shared her suspicion entirely. But given everything Wexley and Beatrix have told us, it fits a troubling pattern. Over the following days, the pamphlets continued to appear, each one slightly different, testing new angles of attack, some questioning Sable's loyalty, others reviving whispers about the true nature of Omega bonds, still others suggesting, with careful, deniable phrasing, that the entire situation had been engineered by Sable herself to manipulate her way into a position of power she had no right to claim. The pack's mood, which had shifted so dramatically in her favor during the trial, began to fracture again under the sustained pressure of the anonymous campaign. Sable felt the shift acutely, in the renewed whispers that followed her through the market, in the way certain families began finding excuses to avoid her presence at pack gatherings, in the growing unease she sensed even among wolves who had spoken warmly in her defense only days earlier. 3 years of isolation had taught her exactly how quickly a pack's opinion could turn, and how devastating that turn could feel once it began. We need to find proof, she told Cade one night, exhaustion and frustration clear in her voice, as they reviewed yet another anonymous pamphlet that had appeared that morning. Suspicion isn't enough. We need something undeniable, something that ties this campaign directly back to the Kerr family, or all of this will keep happening, over and over, until they finally succeed in driving me out. I've sent word south, trying to locate Garrett Vane, Cade said. If we can find him, and if he's willing to speak the truth about what happened 3 years ago, it would answer both questions at once. What really happened to your original bond, and who's likely behind this current campaign against you? And if he's not willing to speak? Sable asked. If the Kerr family has already ensured his silence, the way they likely ensured it 3 years ago. Cade's expression darkened. Then we find another way. I'm not going to let them tear apart everything we've built, not after everything you've already survived to get here. Sable leaned against him, exhausted but grateful for the steadiness of his presence, for a partnership that had grown far beyond the sudden, overwhelming pull of their first meeting, into something deeper, something built through shared work and shared struggle. Whatever the Kerr family intended next, she understood now that she would not face it alone, the way she had faced her original rejection 3 years earlier, isolated and unsupported, while an entire pack turned its back on her without question. This time, she had allies. She had Cade, steady and unwavering beside her. She had Callum, who had trained her not out of obligation, but out of genuine investment in her success. She had Beatrix and Wexley, both willing to risk their own standing to speak the truth on her behalf. And increasingly, she had a pack that was slowly, imperfectly, learning to see past the rejection mark that had defined her for 3 long years. It would not be enough to simply survive Rosalind Kerr's campaign of doubt and suspicion. Sable understood that clearly now. To end this threat permanently, to secure not just her position but her peace, she would need to expose the truth entirely, publicly, undeniably, in front of the very pack that had once cast her aside without a second thought. Whatever it took to find that proof, whatever risks it required, Sable was finally ready to fight for the life she had been denied 3 years earlier, not as a victim waiting for rescue, but as a Luna determined to protect what she had fought so hard to claim. The message arrived 8 days later, carried by a tired courier who had traveled 2 full days from the southern coastal territories. Cade read it standing in the doorway of his study, and by the time he finished, his hands were trembling with a mixture of relief and controlled fury. Garrett Vane had agreed to speak. The courier explained that Garrett had been living quietly under a different name in a small fishing village, haunted, according to the courier's account, by guilt he had carried silently for 3 years. When approached by Cade's messenger and told that Sable Wren had become Luna of Blackthorn Pack and was actively seeking the truth about what happened the night of their broken bond, something in Garrett had finally broken loose. He agreed to travel north and testify before the Pack Council, whatever the personal cost. He arrived 3 days later, thinner and more weathered than Sable remembered, his eyes carrying a haunted quality that told her, even before he spoke a single word, that Wexley's suspicions had been correct all along. He requested a private meeting with her before facing the full council, and though every instinct told her to refuse, to protect herself from reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal, Sable agreed, understanding that she deserved to hear the truth directly, without an audience, before it became public record for the entire pack. They met in a quiet room adjoining the pack hall, Cade present but silent, allowing Sable to lead the conversation. "I owe you an apology I can never fully repay," Garrett said, unable to meet her eyes at first. "What I did to you 3 years ago was a lie, built on threats I was too weak to resist. Delphine Kerr approached my family with an offer, a substantial trade alliance in exchange for my rejecting you and accepting a match with a different family instead. When my father hesitated, she made it clear that refusal would result in the collapse of our family's remaining trade contracts, ruin severe enough to threaten everyone who depended on us. I chose my family's survival over your happiness, and I have regretted that choice every single day since." Sable absorbed his words slowly, feeling old grief and old anger rise together, tangled and complicated in ways she had not expected. 3 years of blaming herself, of believing herself fundamentally unworthy of the bond fate had given her, all of it built on a manipulation she had never had any power to prevent or even understand. "You could have told me," she said quietly, "even after. You could have found a way to let me know the truth, instead of letting me carry that shame alone for 3 years. I was a coward," Garrett admitted. "I told myself staying silent protected both our families from further consequences. The truth is, I was simply afraid of what confessing might cost me. I'm sorry, Sable. I know an apology after 3 years means very little against what you've suffered, but it's the only thing I have left to offer you." Sable did not forgive him easily, and she suspected she might never fully release the anger that came with understanding how thoroughly her life had been reshaped by other people's ambitions, rather than any true failing of her own. But she recognized, too, the courage it had taken him to return, to face the pack and the family that had once threatened his own, in order to finally set the record straight. "Testify to the council," she said finally. "Tell them everything you told me. Let the truth stand, publicly, so no one in this pack can ever again suggest I deserved what happened to me." The council convened the following morning, the hall filled once more with wolves eager to witness whatever revelation had brought a long-absent wolf back to Blackthorn territory after 3 years away. Garrett stood before the elders and delivered his testimony without flinching, detailing Delphine Kerr's threats. The trade alliance dangled as both bribe and coercion, his own cowardice in accepting the arrangement rather than risking his family's ruin. The hall erupted into outraged murmuring as the truth settled over the crowd. 3 years of assumptions about Sable Wren's unworthiness collapsing in the space of a single testimony. Elder Corwin's expression hardened with barely restrained anger as he turned toward the section of the hall where the Kerr family sat, Delphine's composed mask finally cracking under the weight of hundreds of accusing stares. "Delphine Kerr," Corwin said, his voice carrying the full authority of his position. "You stand accused of manipulating a sacred bond through threats and coercion, an act this pack considers among the gravest violations of our laws. What do you have to say in your defense?" Delphine rose slowly, her composure remarkably steady even now, though Sable noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she smoothed her skirts before speaking. "I acted to protect my family's interests, as any leader would. I do not deny the arrangement with the Vane family, but I deny any wrongdoing beyond ordinary political maneuvering. Coercing a fated bond's dissolution through threats to a family's survival is not ordinary political maneuvering," Corwin said sharply. "It is a violation this council will not tolerate, regardless of your family's standing or influence." The proceedings that followed stripped the Kerr family of significant trade privileges within Blackthorn territory, a punishment severe enough to genuinely wound their considerable fortune, though not severe enough, in Sable's private opinion, to fully account for 3 years of suffering their manipulation had caused her. Rosalind, seated beside her mother throughout the humiliating proceedings, kept her eyes fixed firmly on the floor. The anonymous pamphlet campaign she had orchestrated against Sable, now exposed alongside her mother's original crime, since the same handwriting, once compared against samples from her own correspondence, matched perfectly. When the council finally adjourned, the truth fully aired before the entire pack. Sable felt something inside her finally settle, a weight she had carried silently for 3 years, lifting at last, replaced not with triumph exactly, but with something steadier and more permanent: vindication. She found Cade waiting for her outside the hall, his expression carrying a mixture of relief and fierce, protective pride that made her chest ache with gratitude for everything he had risked and sacrificed to help her reach this moment. "It's finally over," she said, still absorbing the reality of it. "The old chapter is over," Cade said, drawing her gently into his arms. "But I think this is really where our story begins." Over the following weeks, Sable watched the pack's perception of her transform in ways she had never dared to imagine possible. Wolves who had once averted their eyes now greeted her warmly in the market. Families, who had once whispered about her unworthiness, now sought her counsel on matters both large and small, recognizing in her a sharpness and compassion that 3 years of unjust exile had somehow only sharpened rather than diminished. Even Ivy Hargrove, whose father's opposition had once been fiercest, approached her privately one afternoon to offer a quiet, sincere apology for the family's earlier hostility, an olive branch Sable accepted with more grace than she once believed herself capable of extending. On a warm evening, several weeks after the council's ruling, Blackthorn pack gathered once more in the courtyard beneath the same lantern-lit oak trees, where Sable had first walked into a ceremony never meant for her, this time for a formal celebration, marking her acceptance as Luna, a title she now held not through trial alone, but through a truth finally, fully vindicated before the pack she had once believed would never accept her. Cade stood beside her on the dais, his hand woven through hers, exactly as it had been the night the pack first voted to accept her, though the atmosphere surrounding them now carried none of the uncertainty and hostility of that earlier evening. Instead, warmth and genuine celebration filled the courtyard, wolves raising their voices in support of a Luna who had earned her place, not through birthright or political convenience, but through resilience, honesty, and a strength the pack had nearly failed entirely to recognize. 3 years ago, Cade said, addressing the gathered crowd, this pack turned its back on a woman who deserved nothing but our support. Tonight, we correct that failure, not simply by accepting her as Luna, but by recognizing the extraordinary strength it took her to survive what this pack allowed to happen to her, and the grace it took to forgive us enough to lead us regardless. Sable felt tears gathering in her eyes as the crowd's applause rose around her, warm and genuine, a stark contrast to the cold, judgmental silence that had greeted her 3 years earlier. She thought of the small, isolated garden she had once tended alone, of the quiet, lonely nights spent believing herself unworthy of anything more than exile at the edges of a pack that refused to see her. She thought of Wexley's letter, of Callum's patient training, of Beatrix's courageous testimony, of Garrett's belated but genuine confession, each piece coming together to build the foundation of the life now stretching out ahead of her. She was no longer the rejected Omega who had walked uninvited into a ceremony never meant for her. She was Luna Sable Ashford, standing beside a mate who had chosen her, fought for her, and never once wavered in his belief in her worth, in front of a pack finally ready to embrace the truth of who she had always been, long before anyone else was willing to see it. As the celebration continued late into the night, laughter and music filling the courtyard where fear and judgment had once reigned, Sable allowed herself, fully and without reservation, to believe in the future stretching out before her. Not as a woman defined by rejection, but as a Luna who had transformed her deepest wound into her greatest strength, ready to lead a pack that had finally learned to see her clearly, and to love the mate who had never once doubted her, from the very first moment their eyes had met across a crowded, unsuspecting courtyard.